On the record. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Video can audio here. So my name is Ito Kimura, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Political Science. And I'm here because I'm on the Executive Council for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and I'm also very involved in Asian studies on this campus. I'm a scholar of Southeast Asian politics in particular. And so I'm really pleased today. We have a session, Public Diplomacy, Telling America's Story, Connecting People and Shaping Foreign Policy. And we have a very special guest who comes from the US Department of State and the Public Diplomacy Advisor currently embedded with IndoPACOM, so USINDOPACOM. So Mireille Zieseniss, career Foreign Service Officer in the Department of State, and has served in places ranging from Pakistan to the United Nations to the State Department's regional hub in Brussels. Were you also in the Philippines? Or?
I was. My very first tour was in the Philippines.
Yeah, great. Yep. So also in Asia, and now joining us here. She was telling me that she has a French first name, an Italian middle name, and a German last name. She's from Florida, and so is familiar with hurricanes as well. And so please help me give her a very warm Hawaii welcome. Well, I think we generally start these things as a kind of conversation, and we'll just start with questions, but you can just kind of elaborate. And really, I think tell us a little bit about yourself, your professional profile, and how long you've kind of been doing this kind of work.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. First of all, thank you everybody for coming today. I'm really excited to be here to talk with all of you and to promote the great work that we're doing at the State Department. I might be a little bit biased, but now there are just questions first of you guys. Have any of you had any interaction with the State Department or done internship or had opportunity to? Yeah. So you know a little bit about the work that we do. I'm a Foreign Service Officer. I'm a public diplomacy coordinator, so we can talk a little bit more about what that means as conversation goes on. I've been in the Foreign Service for 17 years now, more than that. It's just scary when I think about that. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, I actually worked for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which is a small civil rights agency, executive branch agency based in Washington, D.C., where we did civil rights enforcement. We made sure that other federal agencies were actually enforcing the civil rights laws they were intended to enforce. And the reason I say that is because that's a little bit of how I ended up in the Foreign Service. It wasn't a career that I had ever envisioned. It wasn't something that I went to school for. I actually have a degree in journalism. I thought my whole life I wanted to be a journalist. Now I get to work with journalists, so that's kind of cool. And I have a master's in sociology, so I've kind of just, but in working in domestic policy, working and living in Washington, D.C., gave me a real appreciation for a couple of things. One, the importance of civil rights, human rights, the importance of our values, and the idea that there is a career out there where we could help share those with the rest of the world. And I was actually playing softball. I played on a league in Washington, D.C., and I became friends with somebody who grew up in the Foreign Service, and her dad was a multi-time ambassador. And we used to talk all the time about her life overseas and all the great things she had done in her school overseas. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do that. So took the test. Here I am, 17 years later. I've lived in some amazing places, some very difficult places, some very, not as difficult places, but every place I've been, the work has been unique and interesting, and it's been an adventure. You mentioned a few of the places. As a PD officer, I have primarily focused on press and working as a spokesperson, working with the press to sort of explain our foreign policies to foreign audiences, to explain who we are as Americans, to share our values, and to interact with local populations. And that's kind of the crux of public diplomacy work, right? When we think about diplomacy, we often think about government to government exchange, either bilaterally or in multilateral fora like the UN. But public diplomacy, to me, is the reason I was drawn to it is because it's really about getting to know each other, engaging, informing, understanding each other, And I think when you start from a common understanding, you're much more likely to find common ground, to find shared interest, and then you can clearly help shape foreign policy in that way. So it's kind of a long introduction.
Great. And you talked a little bit about your sort of background, but then also briefly said like the exam, and I know I have some friends that have gone in, and it's a very rigorous process. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the whole recruitment process, and also some of the training that you get once you're in. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's a multi-stage process. It does take a long time. So I always encourage people that if you are even contemplating a career in the Foreign Service, even if it's not today or next month or 6 months from now, if you're interested, take the exam. You can take it as many times as you want. I think only once a year though. And the exam is multiple stages, right? So you have a written exam, a Foreign Service officer test, which includes a personal narrative component to it. And then once you get past that, you will be invited, assuming you score high enough, you would be invited to what we used to call an oral assessment, but it's really an in-person group interview. You do some case scenarios. And then once you pass that, you get placed, there's a suitability test, background security check, health clearance, all of these things, and then you go on a register. And based on your score is where you sit on the register. So it's rank ordered. If you have super hard languages, you can get some extra points there. So keep that in mind. And then as new Foreign Service classes open up, spots open up, then you can get called in off the register. The one thing I didn't mention is that before you do all of that, at the very early stage, when you're submitting your application, you actually have to sort of declare your major, right? You have to decide which of the 5 Foreign Service cones that you're interested in. I think, it's sometimes a little bit tricky to know before you've actually had time to actually be in the job. But so there's public diplomacy, political, economic, management, and consular. And we can talk about any of those if any of those are of interest to you. But I would also put out there that beyond the Foreign Service, there are lots of other opportunities to serve in the State Department, including Foreign Service specialists, as we do like IT, medical, office management, diplomatic security, who I think we had a guest from diplomatic security here a few weeks ago, as well as the civil service. And we have a huge core of civil servants who work for the State Department based in Washington, as well as other places around the United States.
And those civil servants don't go through the exam, but they go through another process.
Yeah, through the civil service hiring exam. And those jobs are posted on USA Jobs. So I would say if you're interested in, a career with the State Department, but maybe the lifestyle of living overseas and moving every 2 or 3 years, which we can also talk about that. If that's not for you, but you really want to work in foreign affairs, there are some great civil service careers especially in Washington. Anything from environment and climate experts, global health security analysts, disarmament experts. We have people who focus on law enforcement and security. Like we have a whole range of expertise, geographical experts, so there's a country-specific expert, intel analysts, the whole range. Yeah.
We can talk a little bit about those different options later. It says that partly you were introduced to us through the State Department's hometown diplomat program.
Yes.
And so Hawaii's now your hometown.
It is now hometown.
But what is that exactly, and what kind of opportunities are there for?
So hometown diplomats are diplomats like me, who when we go home to wherever we grew up in the United States, we actually do this kind of engagement. We actually explain who we are, what the State Department does, what diplomacy is, what diplomats do, because we find that there's not as much awareness across the US among the American population about what diplomats do, and the fact that we do serve almost the entirety of our careers overseas at embassies, at multilateral missions. And so it's a way to sort of bridge that gap, to have people understand, to do some recruitment, frankly, right? But also just to understand the work of diplomacy. We also, I should mention, we have diplomats in residence around the United States as well that are embedded at universities that also do recruitment and teaching and things like that.
And so that also means like students can come to you, ask about internship programs or like opportunities. So in Washington.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned internship programs, because that is a great way to get in the door and just to test it. Like it. We have domestic internships as well as overseas internships. We've just launched, I think last year or the year before, a new paid internship program. It's quite competitive, but I think that opens doors for people who couldn't otherwise afford to overseas for a semester, right?
Oh.
So if you go to careers.state.gov, there are all of these programs that I've talked about are listed in one place, and I find it quite user friendly if you're interested in some of those programs.
Does your bio, are you also a federal agent, a special agent? No, this
No.
must be.
but that would be kind of cool.
What are the sort of, you said you had journalist training and you had sort of like master's in sociology. Like when you think about that kind of training, how has it helped you in terms of your own career?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing, I mean, I think you have to be inquisitive to do this kind of work. Strong writing skills. You need to have good communication skills because so much what we do, especially in the public diplomacy field, is communicating across cultural and language barriers. So I think, and for me, like I mentioned, I really enjoy working with journalists overseas, whether that means actually engaging as a spokesperson or doing capacity building, which I've done some capacity building programs in both Afghanistan and Pakistan to sort of build a free press. That's always an area that has been of great interest to me. So I feel like it was sort of a good segue. Instead of actually being a journalist, working across some journalists, I think I have a better understanding of what they need, what they want, how they do their jobs. I'm pretty good at predicting what questions they're going to ask, which is helpful when you're briefing, a high senior official. So I'm pretty sure they're going to ask you about X, Y, and Z. And about 85% of the time I'm right. Yeah.
By the way, as I'm asking these questions, if students or other people in the audience have kind of follow-up questions or things that they want to ask, then feel free to kind of interrupt, raise your hand, and those kinds of things. Because I'm going through things, but if something pops up to you, then please, by all means. You were just talking a little bit about the kinds of things you do, and I think it's always interesting to think concretely about like what does a typical day look like for someone like you. Probably looks different depending on the day. But what kind of days do you have, and like how do you sort of what are some of the things that are you doing concretely during the day?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it depends. Sure, it depends on the day, but it also depends on the job and where I am, right? I will tell you that every day starts with coffee, lots of coffee. But no, I mean, usually, okay, typical day, if I'm sitting in an embassy or I'm sitting in a US mission and I'm the spokesperson or in the public affairs office, I have to get smart on what's happening in the news today, right? So I will go in early, coffee in hand, I'm scrolling through all the social media, whatever social media platforms they use locally, reading, so that I can then, sort of brief up, right? I can brief up to my ambassador, to my chief of mission. Hey, pay attention to this. This is coming up. I know you're going to a meeting later today. You should know that this is, the story of the day, right? So we're scanning. You have teams of local staff at embassies that are helping you scan the local press, put together summaries, put together analyses. That's every day. Just sort of for somebody in the PD world generally starts like that, getting smart on what's happening that day. But you also have to be smart on what's happening in Washington, right? And so depending on where you are, you may have and what time zone you're in. Here I'm 6 hours behind Washington. I wake up every morning with about 200 emails from Washington, right? I really like being ahead of Washington because then, I can get a head start. But the day will always start like that. And then usually it really is depending on, you may be organizing some sort of media engagement. You may be doing some sort of online activity or event where you're bringing in a speaker from the United States or from elsewhere in the world to talk about an issue of import for the day, right? Policy issues. You may be accompanying your ambassador to a speaking engagement. You may be cutting the ribbon on a new USAID school, or meeting with student groups, or in the evening you may have a cultural event that you go to, a national day of another country where you're representing the United States. We do programs like sports diplomacy. So some days you might have to pretend that you know how to play a sport. So you can get out there and really what you're doing as a public diplomacy officer is convening people. And that's one of the things that I like most about the job. The higher you go up the chain, you kind of don't get to do as much of the fun stuff, if I'm honest. You are doing a lot of advising, right? Because our job is to understand the pulse of the local population and to understand what people are thinking and what people care about. And then understanding and analyzing that so that we can help shape foreign policy. Because while most foreign policy is obviously created in Washington at the very highest levels, it's a feedback loop, right? And so what we do in the field is really important to go back to Washington and say, hey, understand this is the policy, but when you talk about it, you might want to talk about it like this so people, so people react the way we want them to. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but every day is different.
Yeah. How do you work with the colleagues inside like an embassy or an organization? You said there's different kind of sections. You obviously have the ambassador, that's maybe your boss.
Yeah.
But then there's other, there's economic, political, so how is there a lot of collaboration between those?
Yeah, there has to be. And what we call that is the country team, right? So we call the group of leaders from all of the different sections across the embassy, as well as from different agencies, because we have a huge interagency presence as well. I mean, I'm representing the State Department, but overseas we will have representatives, U.S. Agency for International Development, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense. Sometimes we have U.S. Trade representative there. We'll have, the Department of Treasury, Department of Energy. So we will have Department of Homeland Security. I could go on, right? Depending on the size of the embassy, you could have representation from all of these federal agencies who make up what we call the country team. And everybody there reports to the chief of mission. So the ambassador is the chief of mission. In the absence of an ambassador, we have what we call a charge d'affaires, the person in charge of all activities. Coordination is very, very important. And one of the other things that I really like about being a public affairs officer or a PD officer is that you have to know a little bit about everything, right? So you have to interact with all of these people across the embassy, because what they do, what they're negotiating, what policies they're working on furthering are going to impact your work. So yeah, we will do it through working groups. We will do it through just informal conversations. We'll do it through formal senior staff or country team meetings. Usually at most embassies, that the ambassador will convene a country team meeting once a week, at least once a week, to sort of make sure that everybody is aware of what everybody's working on. Yeah.
It's okay to just pop in, but you were saying your one of your positions early in your career was in the Philippines, and so I was just wondering if you could talk about any of your projects there or any of the sort of like issues. Were you able to, because I know press freedom is a really big issue there, like it's really low. I'm like Reporters Sans Frontières for safety of reporters and stuff. And were you able to advocate, for people a lot more in your role at state than you would have potentially as a reporter or something like that?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I will say this, because the Philippines was my first tour, I spent a good portion of my tour working, doing consular work. And maybe I should have mentioned that up front. For everybody who comes into the Foreign Service, whatever your cone is or whatever your specialty is, you are required to do consular work for at least 1 year. Sometimes it's one full tour. Sometimes it may even be 2 tours. It's a great way to learn the job. It's a great way to learn country, about all the people in the country, because you're meeting potentially hundreds of people every day. So when I was in the Philippines, I was a consular officer for most of my tour, but I also had the great opportunity to serve as the ambassador's staff aide. It was a rotational job. And in that position, I was able to watch a pro at media. She was one of our early adopters of social media in the State Department, early adopter of Twitter. She was super versed at and really good at bringing people together and engaging and telling the story. At the time, this was kind of new, right? I know I'm dating myself here, so you can chuckle. But so that was a great learning experience for me, was to watch somebody who was that good at doing that and how she engaged journalists and how
I want to be you when I grow up.
Exactly. I'm not going to do that, but yes, exactly. So yeah, I mean, and the Philippines is such an interesting place. We have this amazing relationship and alliance, and so the work that we do there is, we have a lot of shared interests as well. So
you probably have a lot of pull, because being American, it's easier to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit easier to do diplomacy in a place where you do have that positive relationship and where people actually like you and like Americans, and it does make it easier. But it was a really wonderful tour to start my career there, and just to be in Southeast Asia, right, too, and all the travel opportunities. That's the other piece of this that we can talk about, some of the benefits of living overseas. I saw a hand over. Yeah. Sure.
First, as the person of the embassies, my question is, in general, how much percentages you get from the Washington as a guideline of the speech? I imagine that some of the countries, because of the political scenario, there's some of the kind of the word might be very sensitive, so kind of wonder that, like how much kind of like direction that more kind of like that is get from the Washingtons.
Yeah.
Second is the kind of like your kind of like mediation between the ambassador and the media, because sometimes like ambassador kind of like take the media interview, whether is this kind of like is this kind of like in the news speech or kind of like the press. So it's like, do you usually kind of like ask the question in advance, or just kind of like you directly go in, or kind of like how is your advice? And I know when if a researcher is kind of like would like to do an interview with kind of like ambassador or kind of like the embassy representatives, like was this too difficult for them, or like I know that sometimes like because they usually take like interview from kind of like or well-known journalists.
Yeah. Okay, those are all good questions. So your first question on working as a spokesperson in DC, and so I will say that obviously, as we know, in everything words matter, in diplomacy words especially matter. Right? So yes, to your point, you're 100% correct that some of the very sensitive issues are going to be scripted from Washington, right? And there's very little room for deviation. That said, that's not the majority of the things that we would engage on, right? And when we engage on local media, in our host countries, we are actually often engaging on local issues, in which case we have a lot more freedom to sort of, within the obviously bounds of US foreign policy, to explain those policies in ways that local populations will understand the purpose behind our policy and will understand why it matters to them. So there is flexibility when it comes to engaging locally on local issues. Now, there will always be high-level Washington-driven talking points. Trust me when I tell you there is a whole machine behind that in Washington, and it's not just the State Department. I mean, it's sometimes driven from the White House, often driven from the White House on super sensitive issues, in which case we all coordinate across the interagency, so not just the State Department, to make sure that we are all carrying the right message forward. You've seen what could happen if there's a mistake, right? And that's interesting. My job here in Hawaii, I'm embedded with the US Indo-Pacific Command, so I'm embedded with the military. And part of my job is to ensure that the State Department and Department of Defense are aligned in our messaging. And I mean that in a positive way, right? That we are sort of coming at things from the same page, even though we have maybe different equities or different approaches. Your second question, advising the ambassador. Depends on the ambassador. Really, frankly, some ambassadors are born to do media. Some ambassadors never met a camera they didn't like. Others might need a little bit more coaching and confidence building, right? You asked whether we ask for the questions in advance. Sometimes, depends often on how well we know the journalists too, right? And part of my job is building those relationships with the journalists so that there's a trust, a mutual trust, that I know that if you ask for an interview, you're not gonna do a gotcha. Right? That if you tell them, we can set ground rules, right? We can set parameters. Okay, you can interview the ambassador, but we're going to talk about, these issues today. And if you go off script, you may not get the answer that you're looking for. So there is that, but it is all about, like everything, building relationships and trust with journalists. And I've worked with some amazing journalists who work in really hard environments. And I have to tell you that I'm always impressed by the bravery and by the work that they do. You had a third. Oh, researchers. It's a little bit trickier. I think it depends on the issue and it depends on what the ultimate product is going to be, on whether, we can, our ambassadors are quite busy individuals. So it may not, and in fact, it may not be you might come to me and say, hey, I'm working on a research project or I'm working on a paper on X subject. And I'd really like to talk to the ambassador, and then we talk it through a little bit. And maybe it's not actually the ambassador that you want to talk that would be the best, right? It might be somebody who happens to be subject matter expert on that specific issue that you're researching. And so I can kind of help guide that as well as a public affairs officer. So that answer all the questions. I think I got all three. Best of my memory here.
Ariel, let me know if there is anything on the chat, whether there are any questions or anything like that. But if we're going to go on, one of the things that you sort of mentioned is, that when you started, social media was still kind of new. And I'm just kind of curious, how has the job of being a public diplomacy liaison or officer how has it changed since you started, and how do you see kind of what skill sets have you had to kind of learn on the fly and things like that?
You hit it exactly, social media. I mean, that's huge. I mean, as we know, I mean, that has so quickly evolved the way that we communicate, right? I mean, it's done a couple of things. I mean, it's given people a voice who otherwise wouldn't have a voice, right? So it's sort of democratized people's ability to share their views, to reach huge audiences quickly. I mean, as doing diplomacy over social media, I mean, if you want to, hit a target audience, which platform to be on at what time of day and what message is going to resonate, right? So we've had to start thinking differently. It used to be that you could just put out a press release, slap it up on your website, maybe hold a press conference, right? But now you have to be everywhere all the time. So it's exciting. It's also exhausting, right? I mean, if we're honest, right, you have to be paying attention. I think what it's also done, though, and this won't be, a surprise to anybody here or anybody who's on social media, it also means that we're competing with lots of voices all the time. And so making sure that we're, putting out truthful information in a timely way so that we're not being co-opted our messages aren't being co-opted by people who want to put out false information. Making sure that we are, it's also a little bit harder to have deep conversations, when you're limited in your characters. So learning how to use it in a way that is effective can be challenging, especially when you're dealing with really complex foreign policy issues. But I think it's been on the whole for the good, because we are reaching people where they are who wouldn't have had access to diplomacy or access to diplomats before.
The challenges of social media. I mean, even just on on Maui, I saw New York Times articles just about how there's, propaganda and sort of like fake news and these kinds of things that's circulating in terms of what's being done, what FEMA does, and all these kinds of things. And so, being prepared to be able to respond to that, those kinds of things are really important for like.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So the other question that I'm curious about, and maybe others are too, is like over time things have shifted in terms of technology and those kinds of things. You've also been there 15 years. You've gone through multiple administrations, right? And so, like, how does the job sort of shift as different leaders come into power? Obviously Democrats, Republicans, and more recently, different kinds of political contexts. Like, how do you balance that role of being, the voice for the administration, and also carrying out, the kind of mission of the public diplomacy office? Yeah.
It's a great question. I get that question a lot, just because people do, genuinely want to know. And we are, at the end of the day, we're civil servants. We take an oath when you join the Foreign Service that you will serve whatever administration is in the White House, right? And the reality is that, yeah, okay, we watch the news, we are on social media, we think that, everything is, it's whiplash. It's actually, foreign policy actually changes very slowly, right? If you think about it on the whole. There may be a few issues where you have a vast change from one administration to the next. But on the whole, our core values, our core objectives, our core interests don't really change that quickly. So, I mentioned earlier that it's all about building relationships. And I think that's really what it comes down to, right? We do what we do. Yes, we have foreign policies that we have to, sort of sell, if you will. But at the end of the day, we're really selling brand USA, and that brand is really strong, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you have to, sort of, your talking points might change, right? Your approach might change, but really at the end of the day, what we represent is the United States. So it's not as dramatic as maybe some would seem. Now that said, if you're ever if you ever feel that you can't promote a foreign policy, we have channels for dissent, and you have channels for, you can always down. You can, there are ways to do that professionally. Yeah.
I have a question. I mean, you mentioned Philippines, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So you have language training before you go, because Afghanistan you need Afghanistan.
Yeah. So it depends. It depends on the position, and it depends on the job and the timing, frankly. many of our positions are what we call language designated positions. Not all of them, though. And so some of these shorter assignments, like for example, Afghanistan, Pakistan, or 1-year assignments, you don't necessarily get language training and work through interpreters, which makes it, challenging in its own way. But one of the great things about careers in the Foreign Service is that there are many opportunities to learn languages throughout the course of your career, depending on what you choose or what you choose. So we have a Foreign Service Institute outside of Washington, D.C. in Arlington, Virginia. Yep. And we have, I forget how many, 70 or so languages that are taught at this institute. So once you get an assignment, if you're in a language designated job, you will get time built into your assignment to learn that language. So yeah, it really depends on, and then, we have some folks, we have some language savants in the State Department who can learn the most difficult languages multiple, times over and be completely fluent. I tend to stick to Romance languages myself, but yeah, so it is a great opportunity if you're interested in learning languages. It's a great opportunity to do that and then have to actually use it on the job. Yeah. Question online?
Online?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a question from an older graduate student, the end of 13th and in the beginning of 14th. Is there any way for them to serve in the foreign services? Is there any different path to the Department of State for people in that age? Age limit, 30 at the end of 30 and 40.
Age limit to join the Foreign Service? Yes, there is, but I want to say, and it will be on careers.state.gov. I believe the age to come in as a generalist, a Foreign Service generalist, I believe is around 55. You have to be able to serve at least 2 tours, and mandatory age of retirement is 65. So we do have people who join the Foreign Service as second and third careers. Like I said, I had a career before I joined the Foreign Service, so that is possible. And in fact, having that wealth of experience coming in as a second career, as a third career, I think will only serve you well in the Foreign Service. I think it's less and less common for people to join right out of college. It still happens, but I think it's less and less common than it used to be. People are getting graduate degrees and are working for a few years before they join state.
I was going to ask that actually. I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and from what I understand, like that school was actually designed to prep you for the test, right?
Yes.
But even when I graduated, I don't feel like a lot of people were really taking that exam right away.
Yeah.
And part of my question is sort of like, what, in terms of like getting a job with the State Department, having an undergrad degree versus having a master's degree, having language skills, having had travel, like how does that get incorporated into your profile as you're applying for a job? Does it just come in through the interview process, or like, are they screening and saying, hey, they have a master's, oh, they have a PhD or something like that?
So some of that will come out in your personal narratives as you're applying for the Foreign Service. I will say this, yes, it used to be very formulaic, right? You had a degree in international relations, you took the test. It's different now. I think, one of the goals of the State Department is to diversify recruitment, to bring in people of all different experiences. And that means having people with different educational degrees coming from different socioeconomic status, different race, background, whatever it may be, because we recognize that when you're representing America overseas, you need to look like America, right? So there is definitely more emphasis placed on personal experience now. You don't need to have any specific degree. You don't even actually need to have a college degree. That's not a requirement. You can, like I said, I studied journalism. I didn't study, foreign affairs or anything, in that line of work. There really isn't a set formula for coming into Foreign Service. It's what you bring. It's the experience you bring. It's your sense of adventure, your willingness to try different things, your ability to work in difficult environments, your ability to build connections with people. I think those are all the kinds of things that are equally, if not more important than what's on a piece of paper in terms of your credentials.
There's a lot of initiatives towards, the diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI.
Yeah.
I don't remember, maybe it was some speaker here or somewhere else where they were saying State Department, it used to be Pale, male, and Yale, right?
Yeah.
But no longer. But I also wondered, just from a personal perspective, like in terms of gender, like being, being a woman sort of coming through for the past 15 years or so, do you have any kind of perspective or thoughts as you've gone through this career?
So it's getting better. I will say when I came in, when you come in, you have an orientation class. My orientation class was about 75 people and we were more than half women. So there was, there's been a shift and an active, more and more women joining the Foreign Service. We still have work to do at the highest levels and leadership levels. We still are not at parity when it comes to, assistant secretaries and above or ambassadorships. But we're making progress. I think part of it is that those of us, have come in the last 15, 20 years are sort of moving through the ranks. And it just takes time, right? It takes a generation of Foreign Service officers to really see change. And I hope that we will see that, for the next generation of Foreign Service officers too, that we're seeing greater diversity at the higher levels. And as I mentioned, there is a real effort to do that because it is important to have diversity of perspective. That's what we, sort of preach overseas. We need to reflect that. So yeah, we have some work to do, but we're getting better.
We have another question online.
Great.
Yeah.
As a spokesperson, have you ever had a disagreement with the mission of the institution you represent? What did you do?
Well, this gets back to the question about talking points, right? And then you rely on your talking points because you don't want to become the news story, right? So yeah, there will be times when your personal perspective may differ from the points that you're trying to deliver. I think that's a reality in any job, right? We're always asked to do things that maybe, maybe we don't personally agree with, but as long as you don't feel that it's a core ethical or philosophical, violation of what you believe, then yeah, we have a job to do. So it's a good question. It's not always easy.
Another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's all good.
Yeah, but one question is the land of the kind of like port. So I noticed that the Asian ASEAN countries, like the US port is like I think like 2 years, whereas the kind of like Chinese embassy, they work for 5 years. So
Yeah.
things that make different and why is 2 years?
Yeah.
Because one of the thing is that when officers are becoming expert on this field,
Yeah.
just left. So it's kind of
Yeah. So it depends, the length of our assignments depends on where you are. So we do have some of our hardship assignments that are only 1 year because those are really difficult environments in which to work. It might be because you have to be separated from your family because they might be what we call unaccompanied posts. So your family couldn't come with you. So those assignments are generally 1 year with the option of extending for a second year if you choose to. Most of our assignments overseas are 3 years though. So a few 2-year assignments, but most of them are either 1 or 3. And in domestically in Washington and other places in the US, they're usually 2 years. It's difficult to extend on a 3-year assignment. So for example, if you're sitting in Paris, you're highly unlikely to get a 4th year in Paris. I've tried not to. And I think part of it is, I don't really understand the rationale anymore for it. I think in the beginning, part of the rationale for the rotation was that so you didn't become too attached to the place where you were or get sort of clientitis maybe, part of it was just because, a rotation brings in fresh ideas, brings in fresh voices, et cetera, et cetera. But to your point is a good one. You build expertise and then you leave. And so, there are sometimes opportunities to go back to places that you've previously served in another assignment. So that does happen from time to time as well, especially if you have a very specific language skill, right? So we have places where, for example, in China, we have multiple, we have our embassy in Beijing, and then we have multiple consulates around the country. So you might serve in Beijing, and then you might come back a couple of years later to serve in Shanghai or Guangzhou, right? So I do know people who have served multiple times in places like that where we have multiple consulates as well. So yeah, so it is possible.
Thinking about, you're talking about moving around every 3 years. From what I recall, you also are posted abroad and then posted in DC for a few years, and so there are these rotations. So, can you talk a little bit more about like sort of one, that rotation system, and B, like, just sort of issues about lifestyle, like, you get to see new places, right? You're living in these kinds of places.
So it is, so I have in 17 years only spent 2.5 years in Washington. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that's recommended approach, but I love being overseas or being.
Is that by choice or is that by chance? Yeah,
Well, both. I think a little bit of both, right? I see in a great assignment and I just want to go for it, right? So, but they do, it is good to go back and serve in Washington because you do need to learn how the interagency works. You need to learn how the Department of State works. It's a great way to build contacts and connections and network with people who might be your future boss or, so it really is recommended. There are always guidelines. They say, well, after your second tour, you should go do a tour in Washington, or after your third tour, you should do a tour in Washington, so that you kind of go back to the mothership every once in a while. Not everybody, I know foreign service officers who have spent their entire career out and are just happy to do that and never go back. We actually have limitations on how much time you can spend in Washington, D.C. So I think it's like once you get to the 6-year mark, you have to have a real reason for staying. Otherwise, you have to go overseas because we are foreign service, right? So yeah, I mean, it is somewhat personal choice, but it's also depends on the job too. There might be a job that you really want in Washington, D.C. So you might go for a bid on that job. In terms of the lifestyle, yeah, it's a lot of moving around. And I'm not gonna lie, every time like the moving truck pulls up, I'm like, this is it. This is the last time I'm doing this. I'm not doing this again. And then you get to your new place, forget how hard it was to move. And you're like, okay, well, maybe one more tour. Okay, what's on the bid list this time? Okay, well, I could go here, So, if you talk to other State Department employees, they might, I think a lot of them will say the same thing, that, it is a challenge to pick up and move every few years. Personally, and it's like starting a new job every few years, even though you sort of know the basics, it really is like starting a new job, which, is moving and then starting a job. That's pretty stressful stuff, right? But yeah.
But the benefits are like, just in terms of being a US government official, there's housing taken care of.
When you're overseas. That's another reason to stay out, right? When you're in Washington, you don't get housing. Because when you're overseas, you do the embassy will take care of your housing. You have a lot of support from the embassy management team that will help you really get settled. Things that you don't think about that we take for granted here, like registering your car and getting your whatever cable set up. All of these things that you have to do when you're doing it in a foreign country where you don't understand the system. Your language skills may or may not be great enough to navigate some of those life things, right? You might be able to negotiate a treaty, but not, set up your cable. I don't know. So we do have, embassies. That's the structure of the embassy. I mentioned, the 5 cones of foreign service. One of them is management cone, and they really are the ones that make the embassies run. They do the finances and the human resources and the, all of the moving and facility repair and all of that stuff. So it really is. You have a lot of support when you're overseas, and that helps take some of the edge and the stress off of the moving, for sure.
And you made it sound as if, you kind of looked at openings and then you sort of put your name in. So it's not necessarily like you're sent somewhere that you totally didn't want to go. Like there's some flexibility in terms of where you get posted, even though like you can't repeat posts, consecutively or something like that.
So your first 2 tours are what we call directed assignments. So your first 2 tours in the Foreign Service, you will be assigned to something, but it's not without any input from you, right? You may have a language skill that is needed, so it would make sense for the department to send you country X. The way they do it is you get a list of what we call first and second tour officers, so fast officers. You get a list of the vacancies, and then you kind of order them high, medium, low, and then you have a career development officer who helps sort of place you, looking at all of the people who are, there might be 80 people competing for jobs, and they kind of do the match, right? So you will most likely get something that's at least high or medium on your list, right? So for your first 2 tours. After that, you go into actually the bidding process. So then it's a bid list will come out every bid cycle. And we usually do this about a year out. So we're getting ready to kick off the 2024 bid cycle. And so all of the vacancies at your grade level, in your skill code, with your language skills, locations, all these things you can just search for. And then it will list the jobs that are available, and you kind of look at that list and say, oh, okay, there are 20 jobs that I'm interested in. And you kind of decide, okay, I'm going to lobby for this job, or I'm going to, and then you apply for the job. You get references, you submit, perhaps depending on the bureau, you might have to submit a statement of interest. And it's actually like applying for a job, and then there will be interviews. And then the further you go in your career, it kind of narrows a little bit too, right? So there may be fewer and fewer jobs that are either of interest or that are of your grade and your cone or your skills. So.
And is Hawaii on the bid list? Like, is Hawaii a post? Is it considered like a foreign post? Like, what is it? Yeah.
No, so it's obviously Okona's domestic, outside of continental U.S. domestic post. I'm actually, the job that I'm in here is a new position, and it's the only one in the world where we have a public diplomacy liaison with the military command. We're starting to expand this model. I was sort of the test case for this. But it is considered a domestic assignment. So it would be normally a 2-year assignment. I extend for a 3rd year because Hawaii. But yeah, so it is. We do have, I should say, however, we do have policy advisors at all of the commands. So I'm a public diplomacy advisor, but we also have teams of policy advisors across the military at all of the commands and the components and the sub-commands. So that is, yeah, and any foreign service officer can apply for those regardless of whether you're a political cone or public diplomacy.
Since you brought it up now, I was wondering if you could talk briefly about interagency coordination. And since it's a university, I'll pontificate briefly about that. For those of you who aren't aware, interagency coordination between U.S. government agencies can go from sibling rivalry to a knockdown, drag-out fight that sometimes involves blood and always involves lawyers. And the second point is that I think I can speak on behalf of the InterAgency staff and say that Mireille has a very well-earned reputation for being someone who excels at building those bridges between agencies. So I was wondering, now that I've established your credibility,
Right. Thank you.
No pressure, but if you could briefly talk about some things that you found that have made successful for you,
Yeah.
And what the difference is when you're working in an embassy, when it's state-led and you've got a couple of the other agencies in there, versus when you're almost alone, one diplomat in a sea of these military people who've spent a career and feel like they're experts at what they do. What the difference between this?
I'm afraid.
Okay.
Well, diplomacy is the answer to your question. No, it's a very good question because, we hear, I think I've mentioned the interagency several times, and that might be a Washington sort of wonky term of art, but it really is working across the various cabinet level agencies in the U.S. government. And how do we negotiate our own interests within the U.S. government, right? And particularly, with my experience here with Department of Defense, it really has been about building relationships. I joke sometimes that this is the most foreign assignment I've ever had because I come in here and you have a full language, right? That I had to learn acronyms and just speaking a different way than we speak as State Department or as diplomats. But I think it ultimately comes down to building those relationships and actually just sitting down and talking to people and saying, okay, what is your objective? What are you trying to get after? What do we have in common? What capabilities do you have? What capabilities do we have? How can we figure out a way to work together to get to that common objective? Because at the end of the day, we do have a common objective, right? Which is the security and prosperity for the American people, right? And so, and if you asked, I think anybody across the interagency, that's what they would say, right? It's building those economic and security and other ties around the world. So, I think we need to step back. Yes, you're right. Sometimes it can get into sort of a, egos can get involved, so not in our case.
Money's involved.
Sometimes money is involved. Let's talk to Congress about that. But yeah, I think, at the end of the day, you have to sort of peel all that away and say, okay, what are we trying to get after here and how can we do it together? And let me not get in your way because you have things that you do really, really well and we have things that we do really, really well, so don't get in our way. And I think that's, that's how it works. And sometimes, guess what? Like you mentioned sibling rivalry. Sometimes you don't get a say and it's mom and dad that are telling you what you're going to do. And that makes it easy. So, but thank you.
We talked a little bit about the change over time in terms of, different administrations, change in technology and things like that. You're at IndoPACOM, and it's the Asia Pacific, it's the Indo-Pacific now. And I'm, just wondering if you could reflect on sort of the changing nature of the emphasis of American foreign policy and the opportunities that that means for students and people that might go into the Foreign Service. Like how is that focus and that sort of pivot, how is that going? And what are the implications then for people that enter the Foreign Service today?
Yeah. So no, you hit it. I mean, this is obviously an area of extreme importance. This is an area that Washington has placed a lot of emphasis on the Asia Pacific region writ large, for a lot of reasons, right? I mean, from a security perspective, from an economic perspective, it's what is it? 60% of the world's population is in this region, right? Did I get that right? 60%. How many billions of dollars of trade flow through this region? I mean, it is really, right? So I think there are opportunities. I think this is a prime time to be learning some of the languages of the region and to be focusing your studies on this area. I can speak from State Department, specifically from public diplomacy perspective. We are expanding our presence in this region. We are opening embassies in the Pacific Islands that we didn't have before. And that with that comes bringing on new people to staff those embassies. So it's an exciting time as we look at, if this is a priority, which it is, you need to resource it accordingly, right? And so with that comes opportunity as well. So and then, we all know there's some very difficult languages in this region. So if you happen to speak, any of the languages, that's definitely I think a plus. And whether it's State Department or not, right? I mean, I mentioned other agencies that have offices. If we have foreign agricultural specialists, foreign commercial specialists, and people who do really important work. That the USAID, Peace Corps. I mean, they're doing amazing work across the region. So State Department is only one agency. There are a lot of other ways to really serve and to do so.
I was wondering, in terms of the Asia Pacific, there's more of an emphasis, maybe more opportunities. How is the State Department growing? Is it about the same size? And how, a lot of it is probably like congressional budget and things like that, but is it bigger than it used to be? It's smaller than it used to be? Like, what's the general trajectory in terms of the organization itself?
So I'd have to look at the numbers. I mean, I don't think, it sort of comes in waves, right? We will have years where we have a lot of incoming foreign service officers and foreign service specialists, journalists and specialists coming in and civil service hiring. It is driven largely by budget, right? And because the budget cycles are a couple of years out, you're constantly, it's always sort of like recalibrating. I know when I came in, there was a big push to bring in more public diplomacy officers, because during the 4-year period, I think like between about 2003, 4 and 2006, 7, we brought in a lot of public diplomacy officers. So that was a big push during that period. So I think it kind of ebbs and flows. I would say we're in a pretty good trajectory right now. I think, Congress does recognize the importance of the work that we're doing. So
there's no, right now, I recall maybe during COVID, like a backlog or things like that, but right now they're hiring, they're interviewing all this.
You have to also remember there's also, like in anything, there's also natural attrition. People retire. Can you bring people on as quickly as people, leave for other careers? It's not like it used to be where people necessarily stay in one career for 30 years. You guys know that better than I do, right? You might do something for 10 years, move on to something else, or, maybe even 10 years feels like an eternity. I don't know. Which is another reason the State Department is a great career, because you get to start all over every 2 or 3 years. So if you have a career at ADP.
I remember I had a next door neighbor who retired from the State Department maybe at 50, and maybe had been there long enough that he could just retire, right?
You can retire at the age of 50 if you have 20 years of federal service. If you're former military, you can buy back some of those years as well. So civil service, it's 30 years of service and the ages. A little bit longer in the civil service than the foreign service. That is a perk, sure.
You mentioned military background. Are there people, you're working in IndoPACOM, those are 2 different institutions, but are there people that have been in the military and then gone, become foreign service officers, or the other way around?
That is not unusual at all. We do have quite a few foreign service colleagues who are former military in the State Department, among the civil service, large number, not to say a large number, but yes, it's not uncommon to see that. Yeah, and with that, they often bring language skills and other skills with their prior military experience as well. So, yeah. Another one online?
Yeah.
There's one question from an international student from India. The question is, how important is public policy for small states in comparison to the bigger?
Small states versus big states. That's a good question. I mean, look, we have diplomatic relations with countries large and small, right? And we do many of the same programs, regardless of the country's size. Of obviously, it's scaled, right? It's scalable. We might have an embassy that is maybe staffed with, some of our smallest embassies, maybe 3-4 American officers, versus some of our larger embassies where you have hundreds and hundreds, right? But it doesn't minimize the importance of the work. So I think that's something important to remember. Yes, of course, there are going to be the big, diplomatic relationships that you read about and you hear about, in the relationships, with allies, but we engage at all levels. We engage across. We are firm believers in one country, one vote when it comes to the UN, right? And we recognize that every country should have a voice, regardless of how big you are. And so, I think that's really important to consider. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Hi.
I was curious if you could maybe discuss some of the diplomatic issues and outlook that in your current position with InterAgency.
Diplomatic issues and outlook.
Yeah, for your current role and kind of current events.
Well, we already touched on a little bit about how this is a priority region, for many reasons, as I mentioned, economically, security-wise, et cetera. There's obviously a lot of emphasis on the region. Part of, a big emphasis both at the State Department and among the military is sort of building and furthering our partnerships across the region, right? We work all the time with our allies and partners. We have 5 treaty allies in this region alone, right? So really working together with our allies and partners across the spectrum, right? Economic, security, diplomacy, people-to-people ties, whatever the issue is, that is definitely a priority across the interagency, is to continue to build those partnerships, because we can't go at anything alone, right? You need those partnerships. You need to find common ground. You need to find shared interests. And it's to the benefit of all of us, whether you're American or whether you're, a citizen of another country in the region. We always like to say that the U.S. is a Pacific nation, right? We have, so I don't know if that answers your question, really. There are a lot of very difficult policy issues in this region. I mean, that's, you can pick up the newspaper and read about that any day. Not to mention, that it's compounded by natural disasters and climate change and all of these things that really impact this region disproportionately. So these are all issues that we care about deeply, and that we work very closely with our allies and partners to try to solve these complex challenges. And what that relationship looks like is going to differ from country to country, right? Based on expertise, based on needs, based on political will, right? So I feel like I dodged your question a little bit. That's a good spokesperson.
It doesn't strike me like that, maybe this is true for almost any sort of high-level executive position, but, a lot of the job is trying to be proactive, but having to be reactive as well.
Yep.
And so how is that balance? You just got to be on your feet, right? Crisis,
there's always a crisis day, particularly when you work with the press, right? Particularly when you're working with breaking news and social media, and you might have your day completely planned, right? And you're going to have a meeting with so-and-so, and you're going to do this engagement, and then all of a sudden you wake up to a story that, oh my gosh, now I have to completely pivot and deal with this issue. And I think we all struggle with that. That's not unique to the State Department, right? We have the demands of the day, the immediate, that always overtake the well-intentioned planning efforts. So I think you do have to prioritize think you have to ruthlessly prioritize because there will always be demands on your time. I think, I for one sometimes have a hard time sort of saying, let it go and just move on to the next thing, right? I think, we see the thing that's right most immediate in front of us and we have to go after it. I think that is definitely a lesson that I have had to something I have had to work on, is sort of how to prioritize and how to actually manage my day when I'm faced with constant barrage. And it may not even be a crisis, right? It may be that you're working on something, then all of a sudden you get a call from your boss and like, hey, can you draft me some talking points for this thing? And now all of a sudden you're entire, and by the way, I need it by 4 o'clock. So now your day is doing that. So, but I think that's true of any profession, right? You have to be flexible. You have to push back. Sometimes you have to say, you know what, can't do that today. And you have to be realistic about the resources that you have available. I think that's just good career advice, right? But they will always want more with less.
More with less. Welcome to University of Hawaii. Kathy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna bring us back. You said that there's not really sort of a pipeline into foreign service. Do you have recommendations for things? How can our students might be interested in the exam?
Prepare for the exam. Yeah.
How can they get their
Yeah.
chances?
So a couple of things. I mean, I think, if you have the opportunity, if you're fortunate enough to have the opportunity to try to do an internship, whether it's with state or another federal agency or a state organization or NGO, non-government organization or civil society group, I mean, do internships, get that experience, even if you don't have work experience. There are a lot of other ways that you can try to get that, doing volunteer work or internships or other things like that. In terms of preparing for the exam, just read, right? I mean, it really, frankly, I mean, reading the paper every day, being up on current events, understanding sort of geopolitical dynamics in the world, just sort of understanding the world around you. And it's really hard to prepare for something like that, right? But just pay attention to the news, listen to NPR or HPR, right? When you're here. Does anybody listen to radio anymore? No, I do. Thank you. I do every morning at work. But I really think, studying a foreign language sort of teaches your brain to think a different way, right? I mean, it's not, again, there's not just one academic background, but I think it is sort of being able to think critically, being able to, one part of the exam is also being able to synthesize large amounts of information very quickly and distill it down to key points, writing memos, learning how to draft quickly. These are things that, maybe you can practice doing. But definitely reading. I think, staying up to date on current events, reading journals, that kind of, I think that's really helpful to sort of get you to think like a diplomat, think about policy implications, about how things are connected. Because sometimes I think we sort of get a kind of myopic view about what's in front of us, and we need to sort of sometimes step back and say, well, how does this impact the rest of the world? Or not even the rest of the world? How does this impact this other person or this other community? So I think getting engaged, getting involved, having conversations, talking with people from other countries, which I feel like here you're perfectly set up to do, learning about other cultures, knowing yourself and knowing how you react your sort of comfort level when you are the outsider, because that is something that you definitely have to get used to being. And some people are really great at sort of just flowing between, and other people, maybe not so much. So there are things that you, I think, need to know about yourself too before you would embark on this kind of career as well.
I have a sense of what the written exam might be like, right? That it's, it's about kind of the knowledge that you might have. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I feel like I have a lot of friends that have actually gone through and they've done the written exam. The oral exam is sort of legendary and infamous. And can you talk just a little bit about the oral exam? Like, what are they actually trying to look for? And what kinds of things do you do in that exam?
So disclaimer, it's been almost 20 years.
I'm sorry, it's not oral exam, right? It's not something.
Foreign services.
Assessment, okay, yeah.
Careers.state.gov, I mentioned that. But really what they're looking at, a couple of things, again, there is an interview, so there is an interview portion of it. There is a portion of it where they're looking to see how well you interact with others, so you might be given a scenario, and how you interact with the people on your team. How do you share information? What is your method of communication? How do you engage, right? You know, we all have been in situations where you have one person who is just sort of the self-designated perhaps leader, and then other people who are just sort of the mindset, well, I will support you because I believe in, you know, I share your objective. So they're kind of watching to see how you interact with each other. I think that's, you know, it's really important to see how you would interact in an environment where you're, you know, given a challenge, given a scenario. And of course, like I said, there's an interview portion of it, which if I recall was like I was, you know, in the room with 3 interviewers and they were asking questions about your experience, your knowledge base, things like that. Very conversational. And then the writing piece part of it as well. I'm assuming they still have that. When I took the exam, we didn't have the personal narratives piece of it. So I don't know if they've substituted one for the other. But definitely there are practice exams also on the State Department website. So I would highly encourage you to explore that. There's also on there, you can look at each of the different specializations and see which one might be attractive to you. For some people, it might be very obvious. For me, I was like PD, I don't know what else I would do, right? But other people might say, well, I could do economic cone where I'm really focusing. Economic, we think about in very broad terms. That could include energy and climate and environment is all kind of lumped in economic diplomacy for us. Political diplomacy is, as it sounds, you're doing negotiation. You know, you're explaining, you know, you're an interlocutor with foreign governments. A lot of reporting, a lot of writing in both economic and political cones, because you're writing reporting back to Washington regularly because they want to know what's going on. They want to hear what local government is thinking. They want to get your perspectives on things because that all informs foreign policy decisions in Washington. So, and then we talked a little bit about consular. So consular officers are sort of the front line at our embassies and consulates doing non-immigrant visa work, immigrant visa work, supporting American citizen services overseas. So it might be Americans who are living or working or traveling overseas, helping them in times of crisis. Sometimes it's they lost a passport, you know. Sometimes when there are American births abroad, you register those births so that they can actually get American citizenship at birth. So consular work can be really rewarding too. And then I mentioned management as well, which is sort of making things run. So those are kind of, but then again, as I mentioned earlier, there are also specialties too. So if you're an IT person, you have IT specialists that work at the State Department that work overseas, setting up our systems at our embassies and in Washington as well. We have medical specialists because most of our embassies, we have health units to help us, you know, particularly when you're living in places where you may not be able to get the same level of care on. Yeah, so there's a variety of jobs, you know, something for everybody.
You know, I was thinking that I'm teaching a grad seminar right now where I think we have 2 people from Singapore, one person from the Philippines, 2 people from Myanmar, and then 1 person from Scotland and 1 person from the United States. And yeah, so this is a very international kind of environment. Our master's program is also international. I'm assuming that you need American citizenship to be a foreign service officer. Yeah. I do have some questions about like, what if you have dual citizenship and those kinds of things. But the other question I have obviously is sort of like, what are there opportunities for non-Americans to serve in embassies and be part of the Foreign Service Administration? And if so, what kinds of opportunities are those?
Yeah, so at every embassy or mission or consulate that we have overseas, we have the backbone of our operation is really what we call our locally employed staff. And those are host country citizens who actually work for us full-time or part-time at the US Embassy. And it can be anything from, you know, on my, what you would think of, you know, in terms of interpreters and translators and things like that. It could be anything from people who are helping with maintenance of all of our facilities, but it's also professional staff. We have people, like I have worked with locally employed staff who are former journalists at international outlets who know everybody and super well connected. And when you want to get anything done, you turn to them and you say, hey, I need to get an interview with X, or so-and-so has reached out to me. Should we take this? And they are really the expertise, because you made the point, we come and go, right? Every few years. we have locally employed staff at our embassies that are really the specialists, right? I mean, like we couldn't function without them. And they do, so, and we have folks who will work with our political section, who are super well connected, right? They might be connected to the local government. They can, we have protocol teams that know how to get the right person in the room with the ambassador, right? I mean, these are all local staff that are just valuable. We literally could not do what we do without them. I mean, it's and just the sheer, like the wealth of knowledge, that they bring, and and they keep us from getting in trouble, right? Because it can keep you from culture, things that might be culturally sensitive that you might not be thinking about, or any other sensitivities that we, especially when you're new, ask lots of questions. I ask lots of questions, So yeah, so there are definitely opportunities to work at our embassies overseas for non-US citizens.
And then sort of naturalized citizens or like dual citizens or those kinds of things?
Yep. There, we have lots of, I would say lots, we have people who are naturalized and or dual citizens in the Foreign Service, and working at the State Department. And there are maybe some assignment restrictions that come along with that. But I don't exactly know how that works, but it is definitely a possibility.
You mentioned cultural sensitivities in your last answer, and could you speak to the type of cultural sensitivity training that FSOs get before they get sent to an embassy abroad? And on a personal note, could you speak to your experiences with said cultural sensitivities, especially as a woman in countries where women have more limited freedom than in Asian powers?
Good questions. So in terms of cultural sensitivity training, we do, as I mentioned, we have Foreign Service Institute, we do have language training. We also have what we call area studies. So we do have, experts, local experts who will come and sort of, we learn about, political dynamics, the economic, the cultural, all of these things so that you're not showing up completely uninformed. Now, most of us, smart, we read, we try to get up to speed before, once you get your assignment, you have a whole year to start dreaming about your life there, right? So ideally you'll be reading, local media, you'll be watching local programs, you'll be sort of trying to get yourself educated, but we do actually have, ways to formal training for that. And then of course, when you arrive in country, like I said, your local staff are going to be so useful in that regard. In terms of your second question, look, as we know, there are places in this world where serving as a woman is just going to be harder, right? You have to watch the way you dress. You have to, you may not even be able to drive, right? You may have to bring, if you don't speak the language, you have to bring an interpreter. It may have to be a male interpreter, and you may not be able to always get in the door. And I've had those experiences before. You can let it frustrate you, or you can let it make you more determined to do your job, right? Luckily those instances have been few and far between. Sometimes it's the more subtle biases or the more subtle sort of undercurrents that might get a little bit more frustrating, like you're not getting access to the same information that a male colleague might get, or you may not be treated with the same level of respect, or and you have to, I think, rise above, and know when to make a point of it and when to for the greater good of getting what you need done to not do that. And that's something you kind of just have to learn on the job. And unfortunately, we as women have to that's one more skill that we have to learn, right? That maybe our male counterparts don't have to learn. So yeah, it can be challenging. But again, for the most part, my experiences have been positive, even in some of the difficult places that I've worked. So, but it does come down to also cultural respect as well, right? So if people see that you respect their culture and then you're closer to meeting in the middle. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, were you just catching it?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's brilliant thought.
Do you have like a favorite posting, or any good stories, like what you really enjoyed?
That's one of the things about if you ever go to a cocktail party with foreign service officers, they will either bore you or really entertain you, right? Always have stories. We always have stories. And I can't say that I have a favorite post because I've been really fortunate to have gotten to do jobs that I knew I wanted to do or I didn't know I wanted to do, and in the end I knew I wanted to do it, if that makes sense, right? So I mean, I had gosh, I don't know that I could pick one, and they've all been so different. One of the jobs that I had was running the State Department's regional media hub based out of Brussels. So we have 6 regional media hubs around the world that are sort of extensions of what we call extensions of the podium in Washington, D.C. So where the spokesperson stands every day for the daily press briefing. So we have 6 media hubs across the world. I ran the one in Brussels. So I covered all of Europe and Central Asia. And it was really, I got to do a lot of travel around Europe, so that wasn't horrible. I, got to meet amazing journalists. I got to do a lot of media training for US officials around Europe, which was really fun and interesting. That was kind of, I had my own little team, so it was really kind of really sort of on the edge, sort of doing things, my bosses were all in Washington, so that was a plus. So I really loved that job, but then I've also served in places where, you really know that the work that you're doing matters. I think I mentioned at the beginning sort of some of the journalist capacity building programs that we've got around the world, various embassies. And so those are, to me, really personally important, doing that kind of work. In terms of fun things, one cool thing, I was actually trying to think of this today because I get this question. I was once a guest judge on Afghan Iron Chef. Somewhere there is video of me pretending to be her. I got to do one time arrange a press conference up in the Arctic Circle, a mile below the Earth's surface, in the world's largest iron ore mine. So really cool. Yeah, it was really. They had better Wi-Fi than we have at the State Department. All the way down. Like I've done some soccer diplomacy programs in Afghanistan, which is really cool. I've done, it's just like we have things that you don't think are going to be part of the job that just become part of the job if you embrace it. I used to do English lessons in Costa Rica for teaching sort of US history, so people could learn English and learn US history at the same time, which was kind of fun. Yeah, I mean, I've done my share of bad karaoke, which is probably video of that somewhere too. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, you have experiences that you just don't know, that you just can't think that you're gonna have. So, but you do have to be willing to put yourself out there. Not too much. Yeah.
I imagine working in foreign service, especially when you're working abroad, there's got to be a lot of blur between work life and personal life. Is that something you experience? If so, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, so especially when you're dealing with the media, right? And when you're dealing across time zones. So you just have to know that there are going to be certain jobs that you're going to be on 24/7, frankly. Certain jobs, but that's not true across the board, right? And I think we are trying to get better as an organization, as an institution at balancing. We hear a lot about work-life balance. A lot of that depends on the individual. I admit I'm not great at that. It does come down. I mean, you will always have the time zone challenge, right? So you have to sort of figure out a healthy balance for yourself. And that might mean, like when I was in Pakistan, I regularly had meetings with Washington at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night because they're still working, right? It's midday for them. I'm 12 hours ahead. You can't help that. So you might need to say, okay, in the morning hours, I need to carve out 2 hours. I can go to the gym, do whatever. So you have to, and hopefully your leadership, your bosses will, support that. I certainly encouraged my team to do that because you're no good to anybody if you're working 24 hours a day. But it is a demanding job. I mean, it is. Is it worth it? Yeah, sometimes. But again, it also comes down to prioritization, right? Because I think sometimes we take on things maybe that, could wait till tomorrow. I'll just one more email tonight, that kind of thing. And I think we all do that. It's not just State Department. So yeah, I mean, it is a demanding job. But I think it's consequential work too. And so, and you also, I had a mentor tell me once that you have to know yourself and where you are at that moment in your life. And there may be times in your life where you want to go full throttle and it's a job you really want and it's going to be tough. And then maybe your next assignment, you kind of dial it back a little bit and you take a job that maybe is less demanding, maybe at a smaller post or at at a, you know, or even part of a bigger team where you can have, you know, people that you can share the workload with. And I think you have to decide that for yourself, right? Know when to, you know, go all out and know when to sort of dial it back.
Is that when you say you had a mentor, is there like an institutionalized system of mentoring and sort of professional support and professional training? Like, can you take, you know, a sabbatical, for example, and maybe do like a year, you know, executive degree?
Yep. We do have, yep.
Yeah, so like, what are the kind of support mechanisms for early career and mid-career?
We do have details to other agencies as opportunities. We do have opportunities to do academic programs. So 1-year program where you can go to various institutions around the US and get master's or other programs. There are programs like that that you can do in the State Department. You can take a year off and go work on the Hill, work with Congress. We have a program for that. You can take pause and take leave without pay if that's something you feel like you do need a break. I mean, you can, you know, afford to do that, and if the timing for personal or other professional reasons. So there are those opportunities throughout the course of your career to do, you know, to sort of do things like that. That was the second part of your question. Mentorship.
Mentorship, yeah.
So we do have, so we do have mentorship programs in the State Department. But what I see is, and they're great, and they're growing, and you know, they're at different levels. So you'll have senior leader mentorship and more entry level mentorship programs and things like that. A lot of mentorship happens informally, and so, you know, I think particularly for women, as we come up in the organization, it's really important to seek out mentorship. And then when you rise to the level where you can be a mentor, to pay it back. And not just with other women, but with each other, right? Because I think it's really important to sort of bring people along. So yeah, I mentioned a mentor just because I've been lucky to have sort of de facto mentors throughout my career that, you know, not many of them have since retired, since I've been in so long, but you find new ones. But yeah, I think that's really important, even if it is, you know, not formal job training or anything like that. It's more sometimes just someone to sort of help that check. Hey, I've got these, you know, 3 jobs that I'm looking at. What do you think? You know, or hey, you know, I'm not sure that, you know, this is the right track for me, or, you know, just somebody to sort of bat ideas off of. And yeah, I think it's really important to do that.
You know, I thoroughly enjoyed sitting here and getting to ask a lot of questions. Do you have any final kind of thoughts in terms of like advice that you might, you know, you're talking about like for mentors and things like that. What kinds of advice would you give to, you know, students, graduate students, people that are thinking about a career like this, things to do, and also like any lessons, like anything you do differently, or, you know, any kind of things to kind of not do as well, like.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So lessons, I mean, I think, first of all, again, like I said at the top, if you're even contemplating a career in the Foreign Service, explore it, take the exam. There's no, you know, even if you pass, you don't have to do anything with it. I think just, you know, it takes time. The whole process takes time. It's something you might want to do in the future, just sort of file it away. Take opportunities as they come, whatever it looks like, right? I mean, I've taken things that you know, sometimes you just have to take a leap and see. You might not like it, but that's okay. Nothing has to be forever, right? So, you know, I think we sort of are the product of our experiences. So the more experiences that you have, I think the better equipped you are to make decisions later, right? I think, you know, it's push on open doors, sometimes kick down doors that aren't open, right? No, don't do that. Get out there, travel, right? I'm sure you guys, are travel a lot. Yes, yeah, travel, get out there, see, experience new things. Maybe you might decide Foreign Service isn't for you, but there might be something else that sparks your interest along the way, right? Things that I wish I had done differently. I can't think of, you know, sometimes I think, should I have started very sooner? But I don't think so, because I don't think I would have made the same decisions had I started or had I gone down this road earlier in my career. I loved my career before the Foreign Service, right? And I think that sort of fed into, you know, who I am as a Foreign Service officer, the things that matter to me. Yeah, maybe I wish I had studied more languages when I was younger, when it's easier to absorb. That would definitely be, if if you aren't, yeah, languages.
Blast.
Yeah, yes, because it gets harder as you get older, trust me. And then to remember them, and then to be able to switch behind. So, yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I would have done anything. Yeah, but I'm definitely, I'm happy if you have questions that you didn't want to ask here, or things that you want to follow up on. You know how to reach me. Ariel has my contact information. I'm happy for you to share that if folks have questions. Or, but again, State Department website is a great resource. I can also put you in touch with the diplomat in residence who covers Hawaii. She's based in Southern California. In fact, we happened to serve together. I was actually just looking to see who it was now because we rotate so much, but I've served with in the past. So kind of cool. But I'm happy to, make connections if you'd like. Yeah.
Right. Any final questions? Is there anything online or? Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Mireille Zieseniss.
Me too. That's fun. I love
You're a pro. This is what you do, I guess. So you were in DC, said 2.5 years, like that was your first time you were in?
Well, for the State Department, yeah, I was in DC 2013. So I did 3 assignments overseas, and then I went back to DC for 2 years.